this identity of, Uzbek and Tajik is really, as we see it today, it's a creation of early Soviet era politics. But it's had lasting repercussions because now with these independent nations, they require these kind of building blocks for a new national identity. So that's made life very difficult for
Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.
Namaste. I, Mithilesh and Sumit, welcome you all to a new episode of the Eastern Report. Today we have with us noted historian Shri Richard Foltz on our show. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Today we'll discuss Richard's book, A History of Tajiks, Iranian of the East. In this comprehensive and up-to-date history, from prehistoric proto-Indo-Iranian times to the post-Soviet period, Richard Foltz traces the complex linguistic, cultural, and political history of the Tajik, a Persian-speaking Iranian ethnic group from the modern-day Central Asian states of Tajikistan, Afghanistan, and Uzbekistan. Richard Foltz is a cultural historian specializing in the broader Iranian world. He has published 11 books and over 100 articles, and his work has appeared in over a dozen of languages. So, Richard, what motivated you to pursue Tajik and write the first ever comprehensive history of Tajiks?
I think it goes back to my time as a graduate student at Harvard back in the early 1990s. And it was a time when Professor Richard Fry, who passed away a few years ago, but he was, I think, arguably the most eminent Iranologist ever from North America. And he was a professor at Harvard, and he retired just the same year that I began my PhD studies, but he was still around. And for anybody studying the Iranian world, he was a hugely important figure. So it was really a privilege to be able to get to know him, spend time with him, talk to him. Of course, I'd read all of his books. And at that time, when he retired in 1990, he went off to, this was just at the time of the fall of the Soviet Union. So these different Soviet republics had become independent nations. And as an Iranologist, he, with a lot of excitement, went off to Tajikistan, and he taught at the National University in Dushanbe, Tajikistan, until the Civil War started in 1992, and then he had to leave. And so I was, back in Cambridge, I was so excited to hear about his adventures in Tajikistan and what was going on there, and especially a new country now, independent after the Soviet Union. And he was saying, yeah, well, he's going to write a book about the Tajiks because nobody had done that before. And so I was waiting for this book to come because I wanted to read it. And eventually, a few years later, he published a book. But you know how very often you start off with a project and it takes on a life of its own, and it may go in a different direction from what you intended. So he wrote a book, but in the end, it wasn't a book about the Tajiks. It was a book in which the Tajiks were important, but it was called The Heritage of Central Asia. And it really wasn't the book that he had said he was going to write. And I realized after reading it, well, still nobody has ever written a book about the Tajiks, at least in a Western language. In Russian, of course, they do, but Russian books don't tend to get translated into Western languages. So that was always kind of in the back of my mind. And during those years in the 90s as a graduate student, of course, I wasn't able to go to Tajikistan because they had a civil war going on for about 5 years. So I did the next best thing. I went to Uzbekistan, and I went to live in Samarkand, which is a Tajik city. So a lot of people don't know that Uzbekistan, although the official language Uzbek is a dialect of Turkish, and that's their national identity is very connected with Turkishness, politically at least, but a very large proportion of the population is Tajik. And in fact, the second and third largest cities, Samarkand and Bukhara, are Tajik-speaking cities. So if you are walking down the street, you are going to be hearing Tajiki. You're not going to be hearing Uzbek. So Samarkand was a great choice for that. But it was also politically a little bit difficult because the Tajiks were, they couldn't really express their identity fully because of the politics, this, Turkic, a Turkic kind of nationalistic politics, which was ironic because a lot of the Uzbek leadership were in fact ethnic Tajiks. But this goes back to the formation of the Soviet Union, and it was the Soviets that really divided this Turk-Tajik identity, because cities like Samarkand and Bukhara, they were perfectly bilingual cities. Like Montreal, where I work, French and English, or like, Brussels, French and Dutch. They were bilingual in the sense that pretty much everybody knew both languages. So this identity of, Uzbek and Tajik is really, as we see it today, it's a creation of early Soviet era politics. But it's had lasting repercussions because now with these independent nations, they require these kind of building blocks for a new national identity. So that's made life very difficult for Tajiks in Uzbekistan. Now, nobody knows how many Tajiks are living in Uzbekistan because they are not counted as that officially in the census. The official figures say, maybe 4%. But it's probably at least 15% and maybe 30%. In fact, some people say it's 50%. So there's no way of knowing what proportion of the population of Uzbekistan is Tajik. And that meant that it was a little bit difficult to do research on these questions because politically it was kind of a forbidden zone. But in any case, years went by and I focused more on Iran. When I was first began my studies, I wasn't able to get a visa to go to Iran, but eventually by the 1990s, I was able to get visas. So I started going to Iran and I started doing research more focused on Iran specifically. But then, a few years ago, I had the chance finally to go to Tajikistan, and I thought, that book that Professor Fry said he was going to write still never been written, and he's passed away now, so he's not going to write it. So I had some free time, and I thought I was looking for a new subject. I thought, okay, maybe I'll take up that mantle, and I'll be the one to test the waters. And I don't expect it'll be the last book about the Tajiks, but I'm very happy to have got the ball rolling, as it were.
Inspiring following your mentor. Yes. So given the extensive history of region, there are complications associated with defining Tajiks. Who would you categorize as Tajiks?
Yeah, that's the really complicated question. And of course, I talked a bit about, the construction of national identities in the Soviet period and how to a large extent it's artificial and very much reflecting modern ways of thinking, modern frameworks, which don't necessarily apply very accurately to societies of the past. I also mentioned that in the cities of Central Asia, well, they were bilingual. So, people spoke both Persian and Turkish with equal facility. So if you're going to distinguish identities, you can't really reduce it to language the way is often the case today. If you speak Arabic today, you're an Arab. It doesn't matter if you're from Morocco or from Iraq or whatever. It wasn't that way in the past. It's a very modern way of defining identity. So if it wasn't language that defined it, what was it? Well, for the past 1,000 years or so before the 20th century, I would say that in the Central Asian context, identity was defined, it was a series of concentric circles. It would start with your family. So your identity would be first what your genealogy was, who your ancestors were. Then it would be your place of origin, your town. so that very often people's name, they didn't have family names back then, but your name would, if you left your hometown, you would be known as the person from that town. So you would be so and so, son of so and so from such and such a town. That would be your identity. So in terms of this distinction between Turk and Tajik, it was really a symbiosis over the course of 1,000 years or more, in that it was really a sociological distinction more than anything else. Tajik was applied to urban peoples who were involved in administration, bureaucracy, religious institutions, Islamic institutions, the arts, industry, basically the kinds of fields that we associate with urban society. And Turk was associated sociologically, again, with the kind of tribal nomadic warrior type of society that Central Asia has produced for the past 4,000 years or so. Now, of course, there are no hard and fast boundaries between these two societies, because at least since about the second millennium BCE, in Central Asia, with the development of the Silk Road, is characterized by the interaction between these two kinds of societies. And most people throughout most of this history have had pretty much a foot in both worlds, right? So the nomads would very often have connections with the urban regions, and the urban peoples were, in a sense, dependent on nomads for certain products, but more importantly for protection, because the nomads, as a warrior culture, they often served as the military for the urban peoples. So, for example, if we talk about the history of the Silk Road, prior to the Islamic period, the major actors on the Silk Road, the merchants, were ethnically Sogdians. Sogdians were an Iranian-speaking people. They spoke northeastern Iranian language, related to Persian, and were the ancestors of today's Uzbeks and Tajiks. Because they were an urban society, and they traveled the world. They had a diaspora. They had communities in China and all the way to Europe, because they were merchants, but they were not soldiers. So the way that the Sogdians were able to prosper throughout the period of the Silk Road was through the protection of these nomadic Turkish armies. They would protect them. So it was Turks who guaranteed the security of Sogdian merchants, whether in China or in Europe or the Middle East, and that enabled the Sogdians to prosper. So this relationship, it's mutually dependent, because of course the Turks, on the other hand, they depended on the urban peoples for any kind of products, that were produced in the towns, any kind of luxury items or any, so it was a reciprocal relationship. And that reciprocity, I think, between these two sociological types is characteristic of the Central Asian environment right up to modern times. So the fact that the Soviets attempted ideologically to separate them out from each other and create distinct peoples was really a kind of violent alteration of the historical reality. And it's created, essentially, I think, some artificial identities, but over time they become real because now it's been 100 years and people have internalized this and they think of themselves that way. So now today, many people in Central Asia, they think very strongly, I'm an Uzbek or I'm a Tajik, as if you can't be both. Because historically, the urban peoples, they were in a sense both. And so, there's been this ripping apart somehow. And it's really a shame because Tajikistan and Uzbekistan are not really, they really belong together. In my opinion, the best thing for both these countries would be to unite as one bilingual country, like Canada or Belgium. It works, why not? And I think that, of course, Uzbekistan is much stronger, wealthier, more powerful. But I don't think that Uzbekistan gains anything by suppressing the Tajik aspect of their history or indeed their own present day reality. And I don't think that Tajikistan really gains by trying to claim the totality of Tajik history for themselves, because it just, in a way, it looks ridiculous. I mean, they claim all the Persian poets are Tajiks, and well, a few of them are from what's now Tajikistan. Rudaki is probably the best example. But, most of them live in other parts of the Iranian world. And, to say Avicenna was a Tajik or Hafez was a Tajik, it doesn't make a lot of sense in terms of modern day contemporary national identities. Because these things, they weren't limited by these nation state boundaries that we have today.
Tajik culture has been extension of Iranian culture, as it lived in the sphere of influence of Persia for a long time. However, the country and the region must be diverse in culture from Persia over the years. How is today's Tajik culture different from the Iran?
Well, what we call Persian culture today, I mean, of course, Persian culture is a vast thing. And in one sense, it goes back to the Achaemenid period, 2,500 years ago, Cyrus the Great, Darius, the great Persian Empire that was rivaling the Greeks. That's Persian culture. But if we talk about the Islamic period and Islamic Iran, well, the language changed a lot with the coming of Islam. So the Persians kept their own language, unlike the Syrians or the Egyptians, which gave up their languages in favor of Arabic. The Iranians were able to keep their language, but it changed a lot. It acquired a lot of Arabic vocabulary. Half to 3/4 of the words in modern Persian are Arabic. The poetry basically came to be totally modeled on Arabic poetry. So from the 10th century onwards, Persian poets were writing poetry in Persian in the Arabic style, not any indigenous Iranian style. And it's from that point that it comes to be recognized as, some of the world's greatest literature. Okay, nobody talks about pre-Islamic Persian poetry. They talk about, Persian poetry from the Islamic period. So that owes a great debt to Arab culture in the sense that the Persian poets were writing according to the Arabic models of rhyme and meter and tropes and images and these things. So it's a new thing, and this is referred to as New Persian, the New Persian language, which emerges in the 10th century, and New Persian literature. So it's not new anymore; it's been 1,100 years, but it's called New Persian to distinguish it from the older varieties of Persian from the pre-Islamic period. So the irony is that this New Persian culture arises in Central Asia. It arises under the dynasty of the Samanids, who were Central Asian, and their capital was Bukhara, which is now in Uzbekistan. So so the irony for people who celebrate Persian culture is that Persian culture, as we understand it today, comes from outside Iran as we understand it today. But the point is that Iran, in the 10th century it wasn't limited to the boundaries of, the modern Islamic Republic of Iran. It was twice as big as a cultural sphere. I mean, political boundaries, they're always changing. But you talk about the cultural environment, the people in, Samarkand and Bukhara were every bit as much Iranian as the, people of, Shiraz and Esfahan. So it was one world culturally, but as but the western part of Iran remained very much under the Arabic influence of the Caliphate, and it was in eastern Iran, beginning actually in the 9th century with the Safarid dynasty in what's now Afghanistan, that basically rejected Arabic as an official language. And you have Abu Lays, the Safarid ruler, who didn't know Arabic, and he said to his court poets, "Don't write me poems in Arabic. I don't understand it. I don't like it. Write in Persian." And then the Samanids, a few decades later, they made that an official policy that Persian was going to be the language of the court. So we have, the official statement in one of their translations that the kings of this land are Persian kings, and the language of this land is Persian. They're talking about Bukhara. Okay, so it's a little bit ironic because they weren't Persian strictly. Persia is southwestern Iran. They were descended from Sogdians. But they were making this claim to be Persian because on an important level, the Samanids, while they were great champions of Sunni Islam, they wanted to set themselves up as a rival to the Caliph in Baghdad. Say, well, we're the center of Islam, not Baghdad. But our Islam is a Persian Islam. Our culture is a Persian culture. So they were at the same time trying to claim themselves as the champions of Persian culture and also Islamic culture. So they mixed the two. So that's why the 10th century is the key moment in the history of Persianate Islamic culture. Because the Samanids, by the end of the 10th century, they were waning in their power. They were taken over by Turks. But for the next, 8 or 9 centuries, successive waves of Turkic invading tribes who made their way into Central Asia and the Middle East, they sought to gain a reputation as being civilized by adopting this Persianate Islamic culture. So for all the, successive Turkish dynasties, the Ghaznavids, the Seljuks, the Ottomans, they all did the same thing. They started off as pagan nomads from, the steppes, but as they came into society, they adopted Islam and they adopted the Persian language and Persian culture. So, they became becoming Persianized was the principal way of becoming civilized. It's similar to what we see in many times in history. The Germanic Goths sack Rome in the 5th century, but then they start to speak Latin and wear togas and are writing in Latin and become culturally Latin. So barbarians always do this. They adopt the culture of the civilized peoples that they conquer, and so for a period of 800 or 900 years, we have this ongoing process because each successive group of Turks, as they become urbanized, as they become the ruling elite, they become increasingly Persianized, and then there are other groups of Turks from the steppes behind them who start to look down on them and saying, "Oh, you've gone soft. You've gotten addicted to the pleasures of city life, and you're not a real tough Turk anymore." And it's really interesting that, of course, one of the great examples of this process is the Mughals in India. The 16th and 17th century, the Mughal Empire was the wealthiest, grandest, most powerful state in the entire world, and the elites were ethnically Turks, but they were thoroughly Persianized Turks, so that the official language of the Mughal Empire was Persian, to the extent that even when the British began their efforts in the 17th century, they had to learn Persian in order to operate in India. They didn't learn any Indian language. They learned Persian, and the chairs of Persian studies at Oxford and Cambridge, they were established precisely to train civil servants to go and serve in India, because Persian was the official language of much of India for 800 years because of these Turkic Muslim dynasties. And the only exception was the Ghurids, who were Tajiks from what's now southwestern Afghanistan. So for about 100 years, you have the Ghurid dynasty ruling from Delhi, who were ethnic Tajiks. But apart from that, from Mahmud of Ghazna all the way up to the very last Mughal ruler in 1857, they were all ethnic Turks, but who were carriers of a Persian Islamic culture and speaking Persian. And it's kind of funny when you read the memoirs of Jahangir, from the early 17th century. He writes in his memoirs, he says, Um, although, I am a civilized man, I have not forgotten Turkish because he's writing in Persian, of course. Persian was the court language of the Mughals, and they were thoroughly culturally Persian. But he had to remind his readers, but I didn't forget Turkish. He's still holding on to his roots in some symbolic way, right? But again, the reality is that the Turkish and Persian identities were completely connected in a symbiotic way for 1,000 years. And it's the symbiosis that allowed Islamic culture to flourish throughout this region of Central, West, and South Asia, and to make the great cultural production that it did.
So, it's a follow-up question to what you just said. So, would you say that Dari, which is spoken in the region, is more closer to the Middle Persian compared to Modern Persian?
So this is another issue, that I think I attribute to the kind of colonial mentality of divide and rule. Persian is a language that is spoken throughout Iran and Afghanistan and Central Asia. And in fact, older generation, even in the northern parts of Southern Asia, this generation is dying out or died out. But I can remember traveling around in Kashmir, for example, in the 1980s, and old men were proud to recite poems in Persian. And in fact, even into the British period, even non-Muslims, they learned Persian to work in the administration. I mean, I think you're talking to me from Calcutta, is that right? In Bengal, the Chowdhuries, for example, they all learned Persian, and it didn't mean that they became Muslim. Many of them were Hindus, But Persian was the elite language in the same way that English has become the elite language now. So it was the language that educated people learned. So this is dying out in South Asia, but I still witnessed it in my own life, when I was younger anyway. I don't know if you find so many people today, even in Pakistan, I don't think that Persian is as widely spoken as it used to be. So the point is, what is Dari? What is Tajiki? In linguistics, generally speaking, the distinction is made if two people speaking to each other can understand each other, but are speaking, in a different way. We call it dialects. Okay, so we have, British English, American English, Indian English, Australian English. So we might sometimes have a hard time understanding each other, but we're talking the same language. We can communicate. We say that they're dialects. We use the word language when two people cannot understand each other. So Spanish and Portuguese, the languages are very close, but you get a Spanish speaker and a Portuguese speaker, they cannot understand each other. So we say these are different languages. So you get somebody from Tehran, somebody from Kabul, somebody from Doshambe, somebody from Samarkand in a conversation. They're all going to understand each other. It means they're speaking the same language. We call this language Persian or Farsi. Farsi is the Persian word for Persian. I find it very annoying when people say Farsi in English because that's like saying I speak Espanol or I speak Deutsch or I speak Ruski. No, we have an English word, Persian, for Persian. Farsi is the Persian word for Persian. So they're speaking Farsi, they're speaking Persian. Okay, and they would all acknowledge that. But there's this political notion that these are different languages. So in Afghanistan, they speak Dari, and in Tajikistan, they speak Tajiki. And I think that's an artificial distinction. They're all speaking the same language. They're dialects of the same language.
So the Tajik history is very rich and complicated. Now, how places such as Bukhara and Samarkand, which are historically Tajik in culture, but are not in modern-day Tajikistan, how did this happen? And do you think this is an injustice to the Tajiks?
Well, it certainly made things very difficult for the Tajiks in Uzbekistan. And I think that Tajiks being divided amongst essentially, 3 or 4 countries, it makes it very difficult to express the common culture. Now, of course, the most noticeable expression of this culture is the celebration of the Persian New Year, Nowruz, which is celebrated all the way from Albania to Mongolia. I mean, people's all because this is historically the span of Persianate culture. So that even in the Balkans and amongst the Uyghurs in China, as among North Indians. Historically, Persian culture was the elite culture, and anybody who achieved status within the elites of society was going to have some knowledge of Persian. So the Persian New Year, which is called Nowruz, was the most visible annual expression of this cultural identity, which is shared among so many peoples, even today. I mean, you go to Kazakhstan, they celebrate it as a national holiday, many places, it's still very, very important expression of culture, and it's Persian culture. In recent years, the presidents of Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and Iran have celebrated it together. They have traveled to have this joint celebration of Nowruz as a kind of expression of their cultural unity. Uzbekistan has not been participating in this, but so of course people are aware that they're sharing a culture and that they are politically divided. The political divisions don't go back that far. They go back to the middle of the 18th century, which in historical terms is not that long ago. And the last time that the Iranian world was, you could say, united in a political sense was under Nader Shah Afshari in the 1740s. He unfortunately went insane and was murdered by his own generals, and the empire fell apart. And it's from that point that Samarkand and Bukhara, that region, Central Asia, was no longer politically part of the Iranian world. And in what's now Afghanistan, well, Afghanistan is a creation of the early modern era. There was no such thing as Afghanistan in the past, except in the general sense of that, well, Afghan just originally means Pushtun. It only referred to the Pashtuns. So it was the land of the Pashtuns, but the land of the Pashtuns was a land where many people other than Pashtuns lived. So, I mean, Pashtuns today in Afghanistan are only half the population, and half of the Pashtuns live in Pakistan. So these are not political ideas, historically speaking. They're cultural ideas. So Afghanistan was a cultural idea referring to the land where Pashtuns live. So Afghanistan as a modern nation state was only created in around 1750 by one of Nader Shah's generals, who was a Pashtun from the Durrani tribe named Ahmad Durrani, who, when the empire fell apart, he, was able to gain control with his own militia. He was able to gain control over a large territory, including what's now Afghanistan. And he declared a new country, Afghanistan, being himself a Pashtun, an Afghan, and called it Afghanistan as a country, as a state, and declared himself king. He became Ahmad Shah. So it's only been for a little over 250 years that such a thing as Afghanistan has existed as a state. And of course, and what was going on at the same time was that Iran was becoming increasingly Shiite. Historically, most Iranians were Sunni. So the Tajiks today are mostly Sunni, whether they're in Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, or Afghanistan. They're mostly Sunni, whereas Iran, by the end of the 18th century, had become majority Shia. So this religious distinction was combined with these new political boundaries that separated them. So you could say for the past 200 years, these divisions have been enforced, separating the different Persian-speaking peoples who really, you could say, are ethnically the same people. They're culturally and linguistically the same people, but they're divided into, in a sense, three worlds. And I definitely think they suffer from that. I think most Tajik intellectuals would agree very heartily that they are suffering from this division. And of course, they try to, they're always trying to bridge these gaps, and they're trying to organize cultural events, poetry readings, and things between the different countries, and even now, including Uzbekistan to some limited extent in these cultural exchange activities. But it's really difficult given the politics of the region. And of course, Afghanistan now is a catastrophe. But Tajikistan is a bit of a catastrophe in its own right. I mean, on a smaller scale, but the country is not doing well. Uzbekistan doing a little better, but Tajiks are very much having to fight to preserve their identity there. And then, of course, the situation with Iran, I mean, Tajiks feel very close affinity to Iran and Iranians, but they run up against this problem of religion, because they follow different branches of Islam. So that really, sometimes, at least in some cases, it really is an impediment to the kind of cultural connections that they all recognize and want to share.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, you spoke about Afghanistan. So, coming to that, obviously, I mean, Tajik history can't be done without talking about Afghanistan, as about 25% of the ethnic population there is
Well, more than
Tajik.
that.
More
like
than that.
40%, or depending on how you count who's a Tajik. Now, a very big part of the population of Afghanistan, I mean, the third largest minority after the Pashtuns and the Tajiks are the Hazaras. And they're only, I mean, they're Shia, and they are ethnically Mongol Turk, but they are culturally Persian. They speak Persian. I think it makes sense to sort of lump them together with the Tajiks vis-a-vis the Pashtuns. So if you put the Hazaras and the Tajiks together, you're talking more like 50% of the population of Afghanistan is culturally Persianate, you could say. And more than that, really, because the educated Pashtuns are also culturally Persianate. They speak Persian, and they're going to be reciting poetry in Persian more than in Pashtun, and they're going to be more culturally like the Tajiks than like you talk to people like the ruling elites over the past 20 years were mostly ethnic Pashtuns, but they were very Persianized Pashtuns. They were not the typical tribal Pashtuns, living in villages.
Yes, I mean, speaking to that, Panjshir, we know what's happening there currently, and it's home to the largest concentration of Tajik population in Afghanistan. So, how do you envision that's folding out, and what's holding, and what's there for the future of Afghan Tajik?
Well, I'm a historian. I look backwards, not forwards. You'd have to ask a political scientist their view. I mean, it's hard to be optimistic about Afghanistan. It's just really, really depressing, what's happened there the last 40, 50 years. And what's happened recently, it's very, very hard to see anything positive. And my personal opinion is that, Pakistan has a lot to answer for in terms of, continuing problems there. And I don't see Pakistan changing their policy anytime soon. So I don't see, I mean, of course, China has its eye on Afghanistan as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. It will be interesting to see how that plays out. I personally find this Belt and Road Initiative very troubling. I think that, it looks like easy money for developing nations. But it's only in the very short term. And if you look at some African countries, for example, or Sri Lanka even, can see that already in a lot of places that have sort of bought into this Belt and Road idea, they're already paying the price. They're realizing that they have become deeply indebted to China, and it's going to compromise their sovereignty. If you take the example of Tajikistan, this is absolutely pathetic, in my opinion. The Tajik government some years ago accepted a $2 billion loan from China And they didn't spend it on schools or hospitals or roads. They spent it on building a new parliament building, which looks ridiculous. It looks like a crashed spaceship. I mean, it's this weird architectural thing, and they spent all this money, didn't benefit the population in any way, and they could not pay back the interest. So China said, okay, you know what? We've got this border region. Give us so many 100,000 hectares of land, and we'll forget about the interest for now. And the Tajik government agreed. So Tajikistan actually got smaller as a result of this Belt and Road Initiative. China got bigger. China actually was able to extract territory from Tajikistan. So it's not just about putting developing countries into a debt hole that they cannot climb out of, but you even have here an example of China taking territory as a result of the pressure they're able to exert through these loans. So, now China has got its eye on Afghanistan. It's very interesting and ironic to see that while they're putting, 1 million Muslims in concentration camps in Xinjiang, the Taliban, these great champions of Islam are turning a blind eye and saying, "Oh, no, we like China. We're happy to take your money, and we're happy to invite you in and take our, you can mine our mineral wealth and whatever." I don't know what's going to happen. It's the most cynical scenario you can imagine on both sides, both for the Chinese and for the Taliban. It's just realpolitik in its ugliest form. So it's personally, I find it very difficult to see a positive future for Afghanistan anytime in the near term, and certainly for the Tajiks as a cultural minority. Tajiks have, ever since the establishment of Afghanistan in the 1800s, I mean, Tajiks were only able to run the government for about a year. Back in the early 19th century, there was Tajik rule for less than a year. Other than that, it's been Pashtun governments the whole time. So the Tajiks have always been under pressure, and I don't see that changing anytime soon.
I mean, China does claim the Pamir region of Tajikistan, which is about 45% of their land mass. So does China actually has a historical claim to the region?
Zero. They have zero claim to the Pamirs. I mean, but China is an imperialist power. I mean, if you look at a map of China from 100 years ago, it's half the size of the country today, because what's now Xinjiang was East Turkestan. It was called back then. It was independent region. Tibet was independent up until 1959. So. China is an expansionist imperialist power. And of course, you're Indians. I mean, about border disputes with China. I mean, China, has been seizing territory claimed by India since 1962. So, if I lived near China, I'd be worried. And the Chinese, unlike the Americans, who don't seem to be able to look past the next 3 months. I mean, they operate on a quarterly, basis in terms of quarterly returns on the stock market, and that they can't look any further than that. And the Chinese, by contrast, have a plan looking 100 years into the future, and they are carrying it out step by step. They know what they're doing. They are very focused. They have a clear plan looking into the future, and they're the only country on earth that, to my eyes, that is operating that way. And because nobody else seems to have their act together, I think the chances of Chinese success are rather high. But I don't think that portends well for China's neighbors or for the world as a whole.
Well, so historically, Tajiks are constantly discriminated and persecuted in Uzbekistan. So how does
since 1924? You say historically, since the establishment of the Uzbek SSR and up till today, yes.
So why the Uzbek government is not recognizing Tajiki rights there?
Well, it goes back to the Soviet nation-state ideology. So and it was Joseph Stalin that came up with this theory back in 1915, before the Soviet Union was established. And once, the Soviet state began to consolidate its power, this ideology was applied. And it was very much a divide and rule approach, because the way that these Soviet national republics were created in the 1920s did not correspond very closely to realities on the ground. Again, this notion of Uzbek and Tajik, it didn't have the meaning that it did not have a nation state meaning. It was more sociological. And these creation of Kyrgyz Republic and Kazakh Republic and Turkmen Republic, basically what the Soviets did was they got their linguists to identify dialects of Turkish that were the most different from each other, and then they made those national languages in order to justify the idea that these are separate nations. But then people actually had to learn these dialects, and it's just crazy when you see how they actually carried this out. So again, starting around 1920, if you lived in Samarkand or Bukhara or Tashkent or Kokand, or Khojan, you were forced to decide. You couldn't be both. You were forced to decide whether you're going to identify, and you had to put it down in your identity card. And that had very, very serious ramifications for your professional career, for your political career, is what ethnicity you choose to identify with. And it turns out that most of the Bolshevik leaders in Central Asia were what we would call ethnic Tajiks, in the sense that Persian was their native language and they grew up in that culture, but they were also fluent Turkish speakers. And when according to Soviet ideology, which was modernist, it was atheistic. Religion was something of the past that needed to be cast aside. Well, the Tajiks were the custodians of Islamic culture, and Islamic scholarship. Islamic scholarship was in Persian, and Islamic scholars were Persian speakers. And the Islamic institutions were all under whether you're talking about seminaries, the madrasas, or whether you're talking about Sufi shrines, the Sufi orders, they were all Tajiks. And they had control over society in the sense that they were the religious authorities. So in the terms of the Bolsheviks, they were the enemy. So Tajik identity was identified with the medieval society of the past that needs to be thrown away. And whereas with this Uzbek identity, which was really created, in the early 20th century, it was something new, and it was basically a blank page. You could write anything onto it that you wanted to. The other thing is that that Islamic modernism, which began to arise in the second half of the 19th century, mostly in Istanbul. It was mostly based in the Ottoman world, but also amongst the Tatars in Russia. So you have, for example, the famous Tatar modernist Ismail Bey Gasprinsky, who had very close connections with Istanbul. So you have this movement, which was called the Jadidist movement, or the renewal movement, which was Islamic modernists trying to modernize Islam, bring it into keeping with science and technology and modern education while staying Islamic. This movement was taking place in the Turkish-speaking world. So there was a kind of opposition that was developing between Islamic modernism, which was expressing itself mainly in Turkish, which was setting up traditional Islamic institutions as the enemy. They are holding us back. These reactionary Muslims are keeping us from becoming modern. And that was identified with the Persian-speaking world and Persian culture. So that's why the Bolsheviks, who were ethnically Central Asian, who we could say were mostly ethnic Tajiks, they chose an Uzbek identity in order to divorce themselves and distance themselves from that perception that they were part of the reactionary institutions associated with the past, and to associate themselves more with this forward-looking Islamic modernism that was expressing itself in Turkish. And now Tajiks label these people as traitors, cultural traitors. You talk about Abdurraf Fitrat, some of these major figures in the Bolshevik period that were the founding figures of, the Soviet system in Central Asia, who were mostly ethnic Tajiks. But the Tajiks today call them cultural traitors because they rejected their Tajik identity and embraced an Uzbek identity, which again was something which they themselves created, because there wasn't any such Uzbek identity in the past. In the past, Uzbek was not an identity so much as an insult. It was a word. It referred to a tribe that goes back to around the 14th century, and it was an insult that usually Turks used against other Turks. A Turk who wanted to say "I'm civilized," and they would use the term Uzbek as an insult for people who were just, unwashed nomads, pasturing their sheep, didn't know anything, illiterate, they'd call them Uzbeks. And it's really funny because as part of this, national identity building in Uzbekistan, in the mid-1990s, and I was actually living in Uzbekistan when this happened, and I was working in the Academy of Sciences when a letter was received from the president, Islam Karimov, to the Academy of Sciences, a letter to the historians saying that the president has decided, because they need a founding figure for the Uzbek nation, since there was no such thing as an Uzbek nation, they need to make up a history. And the president decided, okay, Tamerlane, Amir Timur, he was a great conqueror, he conquered Delhi, and he made this great empire. He's going to be the father of the Uzbek nation. So this letter was instructions to the historians of the Academy of Sciences. You are instructed now by the president to write a history of the Uzbek nation in which Amir Timur is the father of the Uzbek nation. And they saw this letter and they all went, because as historians, they knew that Amir Timur was among those who used Uzbek as an insult. And the official chronicles of his court historians, they referred to the Uzbeks as like the lowest of the low. Of all the Turkic tribes, they were the lowest of the low. So I think now of poor, Tamerlane in his grave in Samarkand, turning around in his grave because, today his descendants are claiming him as an Uzbek because he would have hated that. So all of the statues of Lenin and Marx in all the cities of Uzbekistan, they were all torn down and they put up statues of Tamerlane in their place. So now Amir Timur is the great hero of the Uzbeks and the father of the Uzbek nation. But that has nothing to do with history. It has to do with modern national identity building, which is in most parts of the world relies a lot on just invention.
So given that the Uzbek government policies are changing towards the Tajik population, so do you see any improvement in future?
A little bit of improvement, yes. Karimov passed away a couple of years ago. Karimov was himself a Tajik from Samarkand, and he spent his entire life in denial of that. He grew up in an orphanage, so perhaps he had a bad childhood that gave him, he wanted to somehow get away from that. But he was the number one champion of this Turkic Uzbek identity and the number one oppressor of Tajiks. Well, they say Hitler was 1/4 Jewish, so I mean, clearly he had something in his own past that he was trying to get away from, but he was an ethnic Tajik. So as were and are a large proportion of the ruling elite of Uzbekistan. But again, their political ideology requires them to suppress and deny that. So, under his successor, Mirziyoyev, we have seen a little bit of loosening of that. So that people found it very, very significant a couple of years ago when the website of the Uzbekistan Ministry of Foreign Affairs added a page in Tajiki. Oh my goodness. And of course, the borders opened. So Tajiks on both sides of the border are now able to see each other, I mean, Samarkand is only, a short drive, less than an hour drive from the Tajik border. And, Panj River in Tajikistan is only right up against the Uzbek border, and they're Tajiks on both sides. So that was a big event. So yes, that's a big improvement. Now they can travel back and forth. There's a literary society in Tashkent that was able to start having poetry readings in Persian Tajiki. That's something that would have been difficult under the Karimov regime. So there seems to be a bit of loosening up of that now. I haven't been to Uzbekistan recently, so I can't say from personal observation if things are getting better, but from what I hear and what I read, it seems like things are moving maybe in a little bit more positive direction. But again, personally, I think that Uzbekistan would gain enormously by recognizing Tajiki as an official language of the state. They have nothing to lose by doing that, and everything to gain. But I don't see that happening anytime soon.
So at the end of the book, you fondly talk about your longings to wade across the Panj River into Afghanistan. I mean, that episode or that part of the text, it was very funny, I mean, to me, how you always wanted to set foot into in Afghanistan, but simply because, and you keep asking who is going to stop me, right? And we're on the border patrols, but yeah, I mean, so tell us about your experience of traveling along the Panj River.
Well, in the Iranian world, much of what has happened in Iranian history happened in the territory of what's now Afghanistan. So, again, as I said, Afghanistan is a modern country. It didn't exist in the past. It was just Eastern Iran. So, so as a historian, there are so many places in Afghanistan that I've read about, and that that have such importance. And of course, I always wanted to see these places for myself. And I mentioned Professor Fry, who was kind of a role model for me, and he began his career as a scholar in Afghanistan during World War II, and spent a lot of time there since. Many of my colleagues who are maybe a few years older than I had all lived in Afghanistan, worked in the Peace Corps teaching English or something like that, before the revolution in 78. And I actually, in the summer of 1978, I was a teenager, and I was living in France, and I was hitchhiking from Paris to the Côte d'Azur. And I got picked up outside of Paris by a couple of hippies in an old Citroën deux chevaux, one of these rattle-trap cars that you think is going to fall apart any minute. And they said, "Where are you going?" I said, "I'm going to the south of France." "So where are you going?" They said, "We're going to Afghanistan." They said, "We got room in the car. You want to come?" And I kind of looked around. I said, "No, I'll get off in Lyon, And I've regretted it ever since, because that was my chance to see Afghanistan before all these wars that are unending. I could have seen it back when it was, kind of functioning as a normal country, and I missed that. And I've never been to Afghanistan. I've been to Iran many, many times. I've been to Uzbekistan. I've been to Tajikistan. I've been to Pakistan several times. I've been all around that region. So I've basically seen Afghanistan from all sides. Once I was in Peshawar, and a fellow got me on the back of his motorbike, and he drove me right up to the border. He said, "Well, we can't go any further," And so, I never got to go to Afghanistan. And when I was writing this book, I thought, well, probably half the Tajiks in the world live in Afghanistan. I've never been there, so I don't have any credibility. How can I write a book about Tajiks if I've never actually experienced life in the country where half of them live? So I really wanted to go to Afghanistan before I wrote this book, and I applied for a visa. And at the Afghan embassy in Ottawa, and I sent in my application. I did all the things they said on their website. I submitted all the forms, and a fellow called me up from the embassy a few days later and said, "Well, your your application's incomplete. I said, well, what do you mean? I submitted everything that's on your website. They said, yeah, well, we're updating the website. Said you also have to have an invitation from somebody in Afghanistan. Well, it doesn't say that on your website. I say, yeah, well, we're updating. So, well, I had an Afghan friend who works for Voice of America in Washington. He's an old friend of mine, and so I emailed him. I said, can you help me get an invitation? And he called his uncle in Afghanistan, and he got me an invitation letter from his uncle, who's a respected, known doctor. And within 24 hours, I got an invitation letter, sent it to the embassy. And the next day they called me again. They said, well, yeah, but it needs to be an invitation letter from a tourist agency affiliated with the Afghan government. I said, well, you said you didn't say that, And by that point, I had a flight leaving for Tajikistan, and I needed my passport back. And I said, look, and I just, okay, forget it. And I was really angry because I thought they're moving the goalposts back. And I wrote a letter, which was, kind of, obnoxious, I guess. In hindsight, I actually wrote an email to the ambassador. And I said, well, I'm very sorry, I'm not going to be able to visit your country. But I have to say that, based on my experience, if your embassy were a business, this would constitute fraud. You're taking money from people under false pretenses and changing the rules, And I CC'd my friend who works for Voice of America, journalist. So that scared them. So they sent me by overnight courier, they sent me back my passport with a refund of my application fee. And so my friend in Washington, he said, well, I'm really sorry that you're not going to be able to visit my country, but you can be happy that I'm sure you're the first person in the history of diplomacy ever to receive a refund for a rejected visa application. And he's probably right. So, I went off to Tajikistan, and I was hosted by the Aga Khan's University of Central Asia, as it's called, in Khorog in the Pamirs, which is an absolutely gorgeous place and a fantastic university, really beautiful. I mean, the Aga Khan Foundation is famous worldwide for its attention to architecture, and the architecture of that university is one of the most beautiful campuses I've ever seen, surrounded by the Pamir Mountains. It's absolutely spectacular. I got a great reception there. And so but it's a 14-hour drive in a Jeep over a bumpy, rutted road from Doshambe. And because the Pamiris are separate ethnicity, different religion, they're Ismailis, they have bad relations with the government of Tajikistan. So the government basically does not maintain that road because they don't want people going to the Pamirs, So it's a really tough ride. But you're going along the river the whole time, the Panj River, which is the border with Afghanistan. And in places, it's only about 1.5 meters, 2 meters wide. And it's not guarded anymore. I mean, in the Soviet period, there was a fence, but when the fall of the Soviet Union, people just took down the fence to use it for the materials. They'd take it home and, use the stuff. So there's no fence there, and there are very few border guards. There's only a few border stations. And so, it doesn't look like an international border. You could just basically hop across the river. And I all in all, of the course of 2 years, I traveled that border over the course of about 640 kilometers, from the border of Uzbekistan all the way to the border of China. I traveled that border between Tajikistan and Afghanistan 3 times. And, I was waving to people, they were waving back, and, I see little kids playing soccer, and, women out there hanging up their laundry and stuff. And, and whenever we stop for a break, I'd say, what if I just hop over, put my foot there? And I say, I've been to Afghanistan, driver, it's, no, don't do that. Don't do that. Why? There's, they'll shoot you. Who? What? That woman hanging up her laundry is going to shoot me? She's probably going to invite me in for tea. I mean, it didn't seem dangerous, but, I ceded to the wisdom and experience of my Tajik hosts, and I didn't do it. So I've never been to Afghanistan, but I've seen it up close, a big part of it, 640 kilometers worth of Afghan territory I've seen up close, and that's more than I've seen of a lot of countries that I've actually physically been in. So, but I can't say I've been to Afghanistan. So it's a frustration for me. I had to go ahead and publish the book anyway, but I acknowledge that it's a weakness. And I had a book launch in London at the School of Oriental and African Studies when the book first came out 2 years ago, and practically everybody who showed up was the Tajik from Afghanistan. There were about 200 people in the audience. They were all from Afghanistan, and they surprised me. I mean, they came up and they gave me a medal and they gave me a huge slab of lapis lazuli, and they said, "Oh, you've done us such honor," and everything like that. And I said, "Well, thanks a lot, but I feel like a bit of an imposter because I've never been to your country and I'm not an expert." And they asked me to give a talk a couple of weeks ago in Cambridge they had a conference in honor of Ahmad Shah Massoud. They said, "We really want you to come." I said, I don't feel comfortable. I don't feel like an authority, because I don't know your country. I can't claim to be an authority. I'm not going to pretend that I'm an expert when I'm not. And it doesn't look like I'm going to Afghanistan anytime soon, what's going on now.
Right. So, yeah, so what future projects do you have in store?
Well, since the publishing the Tajiks book 2 years ago, I turned my attention to the other side of the Iranian world. So the Tajiks are the eastern side. I went to the western side and have been researching the Ossets, who are an Iranian people living in the Central Caucasus. Yeah, not many people know about them, but they are the linguistic and cultural descendants of the ancient Scythians, the peoples who were, controlling the Eurasian steppes for more than 1,000 years, the arch rivals of the Greeks and Romans and the Persians. And so they're an Iranian people, but only distantly related to the Persians. They're actually more closely related to the Pashtuns and the Baluch and the Pamiris because they speak an Eastern Iranian language. Persian is a Western Iranian language. So they had never been studied before by any Western scholar in any depth. And there were no books about them in any Western language. So spent the past couple of years doing research on Ossetia, which is divided into 2 states now. The North Ossetia is a republic within the Russian Federation. South Ossetia is a breakaway republic internationally considered to be part of Georgia, but they've been functioning as an independent country since 1991. And that I finished that book now. It's going to be published next month. I think that, so I haven't started on any new project yet because I just finished that one. But I'm thinking to go back now to the Silk Road. My book, Religions of the Silk Road, has been my most successful book. I wrote it more than 20 years ago, but it's still in print and it's getting translated into other languages. And the Silk Road, of course, now with, again, China's Belt and Road Initiative, it's very much a contemporary topic that a lot of people are interested in. As I indicated earlier, I'm very concerned by China's activities now. And as a historian, I'm disturbed by the way the Chinese government is using history and the history of the Silk Road as a way to sort of ideologically buttress their activities now in this Belt and Road Initiative, because a lot of it is, I think, false. Discussions of the Silk Road do tend to be focused very much on China, which I think is historically inaccurate. The Chinese had very little to do with the Silk Road. Chinese were not great travelers. They did not like to leave China. And in fact, most of the activity of the Silk Road was conducted by Sogdians, the ancestors of the Tajiks and Uzbeks. So I have in mind to perhaps write a book, something like maybe the Silk Road Recentered, try to shift our focus on the Silk Road from the east to the center, because that's really, I think, more appropriate to think of. When we talk about the Silk Road, we should look at where it was centered. And Central Asia was central. Andre Gunder Frank years ago wrote a book called The Centrality of Central Asia. And in the modern period, Central Asia has become marginalized, but historically that was not the case. It was the center of the world in a lot of ways. So when we're talking about history, I think it's good to acknowledge that. So maybe, maybe a project on the Silk Road, maybe trying to balance out the way it's being discussed now, especially in the context of China's Belt and Road.
So good to hear that you have finished a new book, and best wishes for its success.
Thank you.
Hopefully we can invite you again and you can find time for us.
Be a pleasure.
And yeah, so thanks for joining us and discussing your book in detail, and best of luck for this book and the Silk Road book you plan to write.
Thanks again for the invitation.
Thank you. See you then.
Hopefully you liked this episode. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.